Hey, welcome back, everyone. So, you remember last time we kind of went deep on that whole cultural appropriation thing?
Yes, specifically non-Black folks using AAVE.
Exactly. And whether that, crosses a line, man, the comment section just went wild.
It really did. But it seemed like a lot of people felt that same tension we were talking about.
Totally. Like trying to be open and sensitive to different cultures, but also not getting completely lost in being super politically correct all the time. Finding that balance.
It's tricky, right? Mm-hmm. Respecting boundaries, but also letting culture, mix and evolve naturally.
Which actually is a perfect lead-in to what we're digging into today. We got a whole bunch of messages from listeners in Taiwan.
Oh, yeah. What's on their minds?
They wanted us to talk about something they call Ziyu Jingcha. That's Lizhu.
Okay, Ziyu Jingcha.
Mainland China language police. And at first it might sound a bit specific, maybe even niche, but when you connect it back to our last chat about language and who gets to use what, well, it's actually pretty relevant. So let's head over, figuratively speaking, to Taiwan.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Sip and Talk. All right, so Ziyu Jingcha. So like you said, it refers to people in Taiwan who are quite sensitive to seeing or hearing terms from mainland China being used in Taiwan.
And they actively call it out, like police it?
Yeah, they might correct people or complain about it online. And on the surface, okay, it's about words, but digging deeper, it touches on culture, identity, definitely ideology, and even the media.
So it's way more than just vocabulary preference.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The key thing to get here is that language in this whole context isn't just neutral communication. It's loaded with history and, frankly, political power dynamics.
Okay, so why the strong reaction? Why the discomfort? I mean, aren't words just words, tools for talking?
Well, it's not quite that simple over there, apparently. The sources we looked at point to a few things. For some Taiwanese people, these mainland terms just sound off.
Off how? Like awkward.
Yeah, maybe stiff or sometimes even aggressively strong. That was a phrase used.
Aggressively strong. Wow. Can you give an example?
Sure, like the word dosho,
Yeah.
saji. In the mainland, it's common for taking something down, like off a website or a shelf.
Okay.
But in Taiwan, people might more typically say something like siasiam for taking something offline. So shaji can feel a bit abrupt, maybe.
Huh.
To Taiwanese ears, these can just feel different.
Right. It's not just the meaning. It's the feel, the connotation.
Exactly. And that feel is tied up with cultural sensibilities.
Yeah.
But it's also deeply connected to the historical and political situation between Taiwan and mainland China.
You mean the whole sovereignty issue?
Precisely. You can't ignore the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, claims Taiwan as its territory and, frequently makes military threats.
Yeah, that context looms large.
So for some in Taiwan, hearing these mainland terms creep into common usage can feel like a form of cultural or linguistic encroachment, maybe even a subtle step towards unwanted unification.
It touches a raw nerve then, that sense of Taiwanese identity.
Definitely. It pokes at that very sensitive question of what does it mean to be Taiwanese versus, Chinese.
Which makes total sense. You'd feel protective of your own way of speaking, your local flavor. But here's the thing. Can you actually stop language from changing like that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I mean, language is always evolving, right? It picks up words from everywhere. It's like a living thing.
It absolutely is. Language is dynamic. It shifts over time. It varies by region. It absorbs influences through cultural exchange. Taiwan itself is a prime example.
How so?
Well, think about the languages spoken there. You've got Minnan, Hakka, various indigenous languages, and then there's the clear influence from the period of Japanese rule.
Ah, yeah, like certain words people use?
For sure. Words like o, darin, meaning an expert or master in a field.
Okay.
Or tisho, defoshoku, for a set meal. Or ninki, meaning popular or popularity. These are Japanese loan words, and they're used all the time in Taiwan.
And nobody calls out the Japanese language police?
Generally, no. People don't really seem to mind those. They're seen as part of Taiwan's unique cultural mix, a result of historical fusion.
So what's the difference then? Why is it okay to borrow from Japanese, but mainland Chinese terms get the stink eye from the Ziyu Jingcha?
It seems to boil down to the perceived source and the political baggage attached. Japanese loanwords are linked to a past colonial era, but they aren't tied to a current powerful political entity making claims on Taiwan, right?
Right. Japan isn't threatening invasion.
Exactly. But mainland Chinese terms are directly associated with the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and its government, the CCP. The history there is much more recent, ongoing, and politically charged.
So it's about the perceived intent behind the language spread.
That seems to be a big part of it. The sources highlighted a real debate in Taiwan. Is this influx of mainland terms just natural linguistic evolution in a connected world? Or is it potentially a subtle form of cultural unification being pushed, consciously or unconsciously, by influences from the mainland?
That political dimension makes it way more sensitive. Okay, so it's not just about the words themselves, but where they come from and what bigger forces might be behind their spread.
Precisely.
This makes me wonder then about the underlying feelings. Why do some Taiwanese people have negative perceptions of mainland Chinese people or China in general? Is that the real root of the Ziyujingcha? And is there data on this?
Okay, that's a really important question. And first off, it's crucial to say that any negative perceptions aren't usually aimed at, like every single individual from the mainland. It's more often a reaction to a perceived sort of collective image or to the government's actions.
Gotcha. Not personal, but more systemic.
Yeah, something like that. And yes, there's a complex mix of history, politics, cultural differences, and even psychological factors at play. And we do have some data points that shed light on it.
Okay, let's unpack that. What's the historical piece?
Well, you have the legacy of the Chinese Civil War, the KMT retreating to Taiwan, that created deep-seated animosity toward the Communist Party. Then, for older generations in Taiwan, there was the experience of martial law, the White Terror, and decades of anti-communist education.
So deep historical roots of mistrust towards the CCP.
Definitely. And fast forward to today, you have the PRC's constant sovereignty claims, the one country, two systems proposal, which most Taiwanese reject, especially after seeing what happened in Hong Kong, and the ongoing military posturing. All that creates a persistent feeling of crisis and threat.
Hard to feel friendly under those circumstances, but it's not just the big politics, is it? The sources mention cultural stuff too.
Right. There are perceived differences in everyday social behaviors. Things like perceived loudness in public, different approaches to queuing, general etiquette. Now, it's important to be careful here.
Because stereotypes can get amplified.
Exactly. Media portrayals can definitely blow these differences out of proportion. But these perceived clashes in travel habits or lifestyle do contribute to the friction for some people.
And the language itself. We talked about the aggressive feel.
Yeah, that linguistic style difference we mentioned earlier also feeds into this broader sense of cultural difference and sometimes negativity.
Okay, history, politics, cultural habits. What else? You mentioned the modern world.
Right. Information warfare and cognitive operations. This is a big one for Taiwan.
Like fake news and trolls.
Pretty much. There are consistent reports and analyses showing fake social media accounts, often believed to originate from the mainland, spreading pro-Beijing narratives, disinformation, or messages designed to sow discord within Taiwanese society.
Trying to mess with their heads, basically.
You could put it that way. Taiwan is acutely aware of these cognitive warfare tactics, and psychologically, feeling like you're constantly being targeted by propaganda and manipulation, that erodes trust significantly.
It's like this perfect storm then. History, politics, cultural friction, and now online manipulation. No wonder some folks are on edge.
It really contributes to a climate of suspicion for some.
How does this tie into building a distinct Taiwanese identity?
Well, forming a group identity often involves defining yourselves against an other. In Taiwan's case, solidifying a unique Taiwanese identity has often involved contrasting it with a Chinese identity, particularly the one associated with the PRC.
So negative stereotypes, even if unfair, can sometimes serve to strengthen that in-group feeling.
It's a common group psychology dynamic, unfortunately. It helps define who we are by defining who we are not. And there's also potentially a scapegoating element. If people were dissatisfied with aspects of life in Taiwan, sometimes it's easier to blame an external other, like China.
Okay, that makes psychological sense. What about the data? Do the numbers back up these negative feelings?
Yes, there are indicators. A poll from the Taiwan Public Opinion Foundation in early 2024 found over 60% of Taiwanese distrust the government of China, with only about 10% expressing trust.
Wow, that's a big gap.
It is. And research out of National Taiwan University has suggested a correlation. More negative media coverage of China tends to align with worsening public perception in Taiwan.
And online, where the Ziyujingcha might be active.
Anecdotally, yes. Discussions on popular Taiwanese forums like PTT and Dcard often link terms like mainland tourists or mainland slang with negative comments or sentiments.
Okay, so the negativity is measurable, But you said earlier it's important not to paint everyone with the same brush.
Absolutely critical. The sources consistently emphasize the need to distinguish between Taiwanese views of the PRC government and their views of mainland Chinese people.
And the data shows that distinction.
It does. For instance, a Brookings Institution report from 2022 found that while 63% of Taiwanese held an unfavorable view of the PRC government.
Which is high.
Very high. But the unfavorable view of mainland Chinese people was lower at 42%. And significantly, 46% held a neutral view of the people.
Okay, so less negativity towards individuals and a big chunk are neutral.
Exactly. And look at identity figures. Pew Research Center data from 2024 showed 67% of people in Taiwan identify primarily as Taiwanese. Only 3% identify primarily as Chinese. Another 28% identify as both.
That points strongly towards a distinct Taiwanese identity.
It does. And it suggests the resistance to unification and maybe the sensitivity to mainland terms is much more about rejecting the PRC's political system and influence than it is about a fundamental dislike of Chinese culture or people as individuals.
So the Ziyujingcha are reacting more to the perceived political encroachment via language, not just because they dislike mainlanders personally.
That seems to be the more accurate interpretation based on the data and analysis. It's resistance to perceived political pressure from the PRC.
Man, this is layered. And speaking of layers, the sources kept bringing up how difficult it is to separate China from the Communist Party, how the CCP has intentionally blurred those lines.
Yes, that's a central theme. Making China, Communist Party, Chinese culture, Chinese people seem like one inseparable thing.
How on earth have they managed that? And why is it so important for them?
It's absolutely fundamental to the CCP's legitimacy and its efforts to maintain control, both domestically and in terms of its international image. They've used a really sophisticated long-term strategy involving multiple approaches.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first method?
First is establishing what you could call a discourse monopoly. Basically, controlling the narrative, controlling the language used to talk about politics and identity.
How does that work in practice?
A core element is the concept Xi Jinping often emphasizes. The party leads everything. This isn't just saying they're the ruling party, it's asserting the CCP's absolute, unquestionable authority over all aspects of the state and society. It dismisses the legitimacy of things like multi-party systems or power rotation.
So it's our way or the highway, basically.
Pretty much. And this lets them manipulate key terms. For example, loving the country, Aikaway, is systematically equated with loving the party, Ayandening.
Ah, so criticizing the party becomes
unpatriotic, or even insulting China, Brahma. If you question the government's policies, say on Xinjiang, or how they handled the pandemic,
you're not just disagreeing, you're attacking China itself.
That's how it's framed. Criticism gets labeled as hostile foreign forces interfering, or anti-China sentiment. It creates these forbidden zones for discussion.
Wow. Okay, controlling the words. What's next?
Second is controlling education and the historical narrative. The official version of history, taught in schools and promoted in state media, heavily emphasizes the CCP's role in saving China, liberating it from foreign oppression and internal chaos.
Highlighting the victories.
And crucially, downplaying or entirely omitting the negatives. Things like the Great Leap Forward famine, the Cultural Revolution's chaos, the Tiananmen Square crackdown. These are often minimized, justified, or simply erased from the mainstream narrative.
A very curated version of the past.
Extremely curated. It positions the CCP as the inevitable and sole legitimate heir to Chinese civilization, crediting all modern achievements to the party. For instance, the role of the nationalist government in fighting Japan during WWII is often significantly downplayed compared to the CCP's contribution.
Shaping the collective memory to fit their story.
Exactly. If you control the past, you shape how people understand the present and the party's role in it.
Makes sense. And the media's role today.
That's the third pillar.
Yeah.
Media manipulation combined with stoking nationalism. All major media outlets in China are state-controlled or heavily influenced. They require allegiance to the party line.
So no independent press challenging the narrative.
Effectively, no. And they constantly use loaded language. Our country, often implicitly meaning the CCP-led state, hostile foreign forces, Western interference, creating an us versus them mentality.
Riling people up.
Yes, whipping up nationalist sentiment is a key tactic. When facing diplomatic friction or domestic pressure, the CCP often redirects public anger towards external targets, the US, Japan, sometimes Taiwan.
They equate defending the CCP with defending national dignity.
And that insulting China thing you mentioned, they've weaponized it. International brands, celebrities, academics, anyone who says or does something perceived as challenging the CCP line on sensitive issues like Taiwan, Tibet, Hong Kong, or human rights can face massive nationalist backlash online, boycotts, the works. It chills speech globally.
We've definitely seen that happen. Okay, so discourse, history, media. What's the last piece? Culture.
Yes. The fourth part is binding culture and identity tightly to the party state. The CCP strategically co-opts traditional cultural symbols, Confucianism, the Great Wall, Tang Dynasty imagery, etc., presenting them as symbols of the China that the CCP leads.
So liking traditional culture somehow equals supporting the party.
They try to create that link. They promote excellent traditional Chinese culture, but it's always a selective promotion that serves the regime's narrative and legitimacy. Even initiatives like the Confucius Institutes abroad, ostensibly for language and culture promotion.
They faced criticism, right?
Yeah, for political censorship, presenting a CCP-approved view of China, and potentially acting as platforms for the party's United Front work, which is about expanding influence and co-opting groups overseas.
And pressure on Chinese people abroad.
Definitely. There's an expectation, sometimes explicit pressure, for overseas Chinese communities and individuals to be patriotic, which again often means supporting the CCP's positions. They engage in monitoring and try to ensure people speak for China in the approved way.
It sounds incredibly thorough, like a multi-pronged strategy to fuse the party with the very idea of being Chinese.
That's exactly the goal. The overall effect is to create these forbidden zones where criticism is taboo, leading to widespread self-censorship both inside China and sometimes among the diaspora.
Because the personal cost of speaking out is too high.
Right. By blurring these lines, China, CCP, culture, people, any criticism risks being framed by the state and perceived by many as an attack on the nation or the culture itself, leading to social ostracism or worse. It cultivates a specific psychological state. Supporting the CCP equals patriotism. Criticizing the CCP equals treason or insulting your own heritage.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to take in. And bringing it all back to where we started with the Ziyu in Taiwan.
It really puts that sensitivity into perspective, doesn't it?
It does. It shows it's not just about, vocabulary choices. It's deeply entangled with this massive, complex web of identity, history, cross-strait politics, and this very deliberate campaign by the CCP to equate itself with everything Chinese.
Absolutely. The Ziyu phenomenon, however you view it, reflects the complexities of Taiwanese identity in relation to China. It underscores how potent the link between language and identity can be, and it highlights that crucial distinction many Taiwanese try to maintain between the PRC government and Chinese people or culture.
A distinction the CCP actively works to erase.
Precisely. That blurring is a political strategy. So yeah, language here is far from neutral. It's carrying immense historical and political weight.
This has been really illuminating, seriously. It really makes you think about how language isn't just how we communicate, but how it actively shapes our sense of self, our politics, our perception of the world.
Especially when powerful entities are consciously trying to manipulate that shaping process.
Yeah. And it shows just how challenging it is navigating these cultural and political sensitivities in our hyper-connected world, where those lines are constantly being drawn, blurred, and contested.
It really does. And maybe that leaves a thought for you listening. How does the language you use, or the language you hear, shape your identity and your view of political situations? How do you navigate those blurry lines between culture, politics, and people?
Definitely some food for thought there. All right, folks, that's about all the time we have for this deep dive. We really hope you found this exploration interesting and maybe learned something new.
If you want to keep digging into these kinds of complex topics with us, please do hit that subscribe button for Sip and Talk.
And hey, also, give our good friend Micky's YouTube channel a look. We'll put the link in the show notes. It's great stuff.
Until next time.
Stay curious, everyone.